Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Erin Farley, and I am one of JRSA's research associates. For those of you who may be less familiar with JRSA, it stands for the Justice Research and Statistics Association, and we are a national nonprofit organization dedicated to the use of research and analysis to inform criminal and juvenile justice decision-making, and we are comprised of a network of researchers and practitioners, which at the core include directors and staff from the state statistical analysis centers. So it is my pleasure today to welcome you to our webinar titled Tracking Defendants Across Databases, and it will be presented by Matt Landon. Matt is a research analyst with the Washington SAC, where he studies issues affecting adult offenders at each stage of the criminal justice process. And in addition, he earned his MS in criminal justice from the University of Cincinnati in 2015, and has also spent some time prior to the Washington SAC at the West Virginia Division of Justice and Community Services. So welcome, Matt. Before we dive into the presentation, I wanted to first cover some logistical items, as well as thank the Bureau of Justice Statistics for helping to make this webinar possible. So we will be recording today's session, and this webinar will be available on our website in the next couple of days. Today's webinar is being audiocast via the speakers on your computer and also teleconference. So you can either use a phone number or your computer speakers to listen to the presentation today. If you are not automatically prompted with the audio conference information, you can go to the top of the menu bar, click on audio, then select audio conference. And once you do this, a window should appear where you can choose between calling in or joining the audio conference via your computer. Since everyone is muted upon entry, if you do have a question for the presenter, please click on the chat feature, which is on the right side of your screen, and then you can select to send a question to, which we prefer, to the host, the presenter, and the panelists, so that goes to everyone. So this session is scheduled for 1 hour. At the end of the hour, we will have a quick poll for you all to complete. We would really appreciate you filling that out. It really helps us get feedback on what we're doing and how to continue improving. And also, we would like you to help us count how many people are attending our webinars. And so we know that in some situations there are multiple people watching at one computer. And so if you are one of those people, what we would really appreciate is if you could, in the chat feature, write your name, whoever registered, and then the number of people, including yourself, that are in the room. So that just helps us, again, count how many people are attending these webinars. Great. Oh, and as a quick note, we do have another upcoming webinar. It is scheduled for June 14th, and it is titled From Report to Conviction, Understanding Sexual Assault Case Attrition. And it is going to be led by Melissa Morabito, April Padavina, and Linda Williams. Right now, there is no registration up for that, but I believe we will be getting that up in the next couple of days or early next week. So keep an eye out for that. And we have some other webinars that are also being planned out and finalized for over the summer. So keep an eye out for those. There will be more coming. Okay, so I think that is all I have for you. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to now pass the magic ball over to Matt and let him take it away. So Matt, it's all yours.
All right, thanks, Erin. And wow, hey, thanks all for attending this afternoon. Really great to see so many people from all across the country. Always kind of blows me away. I've been an attendee in webinars before, and it is a fantastic feeling to see all of you here. So back when we were first thinking about doing a presentation, we, in 2016, conducted a study. The name of that study was Of Jobs in Jail, Outcomes for Washington State Property Offenders. And that study, as fascinating as it was rather routine as it goes for criminal justice studies. And what I did not want to do was end up giving a full presentation on just the study and its findings, because while I find it fascinating, it's mostly relevant to the state of Washington and probably something that a lot of you are very familiar with either by reading the literature, conducting them yourself, and just your overall general familiarity with how criminal justice research works. But there is one particular piece that the Washington SAC has in this study that I find might be unique to us, perhaps a few other agencies out there, and is something that I at least want to highlight as a piece of criminal justice research that has been particularly useful to me in the last few years. To just begin with this premise, research in criminal justice very, very often ends up being restricted to a single database. And what I mean by that is that you might be looking at, for example, a database from your Department of Corrections, and within that, perhaps just a database that pertains to prisons. When you're looking at that database, you're able to measure any variable inside that database against any other, but that's it. That's sort of your limit. If you have a question that goes beyond just that database, you end up in a little bit of a trap. Now, this can be completely fine if all of your questions exist inside of a single database, and I've included a couple examples here. How have the demographic traits of prisoners changed over a given time period? You can look at ranges, averages, anything involved in that data set. You can ask how many offenders recidivate, but only as evidenced by a second entry in that same database. So we might be able to take a prison set and see how many people return to prison, but we wouldn't be able to answer questions about arrests or perhaps repeat entries into jail. We could only really look at prison. So we ultimately often want to look at multiple databases. But then we run into a second problem. Sometimes these databases are linked for us, and that's pretty handy. But that often only happens in the context of criminal justice, and then it's not always as great as we might hope. So we might have that prison data set. And then we have a question that relates to the courts. So we have a linking variable that links somebody who's sentenced to their ultimate prison sentence. That's great. Now we can look at things that happened during their time in court and during their time in prison. But we might still not have a linking variable to check out what happens in their arrest, and perhaps even more frustrating, we might not have a linking variable to find out what happens to them after they're released. We still can't get re-arrest very well just by linking courts and prisons. So one option that we can do in this case is to examine each point of the question separately. So an example up here, what degree did judges choose a specific type of alternative sentence? And then how did the overall recidivism rate change following that period? There we might have two different databases, two different measures, but unfortunately not a very strong connection between our independent variable and our outcome measure. We just know that something changed at one point. We can measure the degree to which it changed, but we don't necessarily have a strong argument for how it was connected to that outcome. We can also, I think a very common question that we get, do drug arrests drop after prisons begin offering treatment programs? Fantastic question. And we can often track these, and sometimes that's a perfectly acceptable answer to get a drop in drug arrests following that treatment program, but it is very hard to argue for causation much more than you can get correlation. But there may be another option in some of these cases. And this is really what I'm driving at with this presentation, is that when you get enough personally identifiable information, or PII, available, there are ways in which you can take that, just the PII, without any other research ID necessarily crafted for you to link it, and use the PII between two different databases to link offenders. And with that information, once you're able to get people linked, you can begin focusing on more complex questions and a much broader array of variables. So for example, how often do those sentenced to jail find employment as compared to those in prison? Or maybe what factors of a prison stay are associated with higher wages earned after release. Those questions are not only richer, but we can actually start driving into individual characteristics and perhaps their association with these things. You can also begin looking at the interaction of various outcome variables on each other. For example, how someone's employment, which might be housed in its own database, seems to alter their recidivism rates, and specifically the recidivism rates for rearrest, or perhaps for all the way through the system, a return to prison. So that, I think, is an ideal. We want to have, as criminal justice researchers, a particularly rich set of data, but getting there can be the tricky part. So a little bit first about the study that is kind of underpinning this whole thing. I mentioned at the start, it was called Jobs in Jail, and it was done in 2016, and it was based on some prior work with the Council of State Governments. In Washington, we previously took a look at our drug offenses and the amount of people who are going to prison under a drug sentence, and eventually restructured the drug sentencing grid in an attempt to better target and better address a lot of the issues that were coming up. And there was a similar drive that came about with property offenses in this state. A lot of that stemmed back to the fact that our property crime rates were abnormally high. And so a lot of questions started to swirl around what exactly was going to be done. And the restructured property grid was a suggestion. At that point, this study started to get underway, and then that law did not go through. So we were in the midst of a study with no property offender grid, which was originally what we were going to lay the baseline for. So we, as researchers often need to, had to adapt. And we switched over to saying, okay, well, we're not necessarily establishing the baselines for a property offender grid to be measured on later years, but we will still establish the baselines for property offenders and their outcomes so that any future effort, no matter what it is, will be able to look back at 2016 and say, okay, here's a study that gives us a look at offenders from about 2000 to 2015, and here's what it looked like then as compared to potentially in the future what it might look like later. But to even begin to answer these questions, we needed to match a number of criminal justice system databases with some external information. So we took three primary data sources for this study. There was the Washington State Institute for Public Policy's criminal history records. These get back into conviction. So this is just, these people who are convicted don't necessarily go to prison. They may end up in jail, or they might have community supervision or an even lesser sentence. We also have our Department of Corrections offender files, these generally being people who went to prison. And that is sort of our core database for this study. These were the main people we were focused on. Entry into this study as a property offender was graded on if you had gone to prison for a property offense at some point, and that's the point in the study where we started to track them. The reason for that was mostly because a lot of the laws that were focused on this were aimed at reducing prison rates for property offenses, and so that was sort of the core group we were looking at, the people who are already getting prison offenses, what are they like? The last data set that we wanted to include was the unemployment insurance database. That also contains wages, employment, and employer information. So that's not criminal justice related at all. Any linking data that we would normally have in there that we could say, you know, take a court ID and maybe the prisons track that same court ID and we link them together, that's not in the unemployment insurance database at all. In fact, that database includes a lot of people who aren't even criminal justice involved. And so having that as a resource is a huge thing if we're able to connect it. And in fact, we were. I wanted to first talk about a couple selected findings, just really quick to show the sort of things that came out of this. We were able to look at that first conviction for a property offense to a reconviction, that being in the Washington State Institute for Public Policy database, we ended up with a rate of about 68.7% of people who had at least one property conviction coming back and getting a second conviction. Those who were just in the Department of Corrections coming back to get any other conviction was about 59.3%. Going from the Department of Corrections and re-entering prison again was a bit lower, but still at a 34% recidivism rate within this group. We also did a little bit of tracking for their average time to recidivism, giving a little bit of a scalar value to that measure. And then we also were able to look at their post-release employment. A little under 60% of these people ended up employed post-release, and they had about an average wage of $13.66 per hour. And that is a vast simplification of a lot of the data. But giving just a quick overview, this is another one of the pieces that we were able to examine because we connected all three of these data sets. So here we have some bar graphs that show so there's some different groups that we measured for having none of their time spent in DOC custody actually behind bars. They were always in some form of community program or supervision, being paroled, all the way up to their entire time being spent behind bars. And we took a look at some differences in outcomes based on their recidivism or their employment. And the different colored bars sort of show you the three different data sets. We've got their recidivism by any conviction, that's the conviction data set. Their recidivism by a return to prison, that we could have just done with a single data set, no matching. And finally, their employment post-release, that really relied on the wage data. So there's kind of three different data sets worth of data, all matched by individual identifiers. And this is made possible just by that. And so this is just one of the sample findings that we were able to put out because of that. So with that said, now I kind of want to delve into the meat and potatoes, the match method itself. So this is something that I want to frame in a way that is accessible no matter what you're using, any sort of software you might be able to do this, so long as you've got data. There are going to be a few requirements of the data sets you're working with, but I'm getting less into the specifics of the code and a little more into the process of what you need to look for and what requirements you might have when doing this. So when we were working on our match method, we have a fantastic group over with us in our agency called the Education Research and Data Center, or the ERDC. They're the real experts at doing this, and they were a very integral part of this process because for our study, when we were proposing this to the IRB and getting approval, we're working with prisoners. And I'm guessing many of you as well work with prisoners or other populations considered vulnerable by the IRB. Getting their personally identifiable information can be a big ask because that puts them at a higher level of risk in your study than just having de-identified information. One way that it is possible to mitigate that when working with an IRB, or at least in our case, was to say, okay, we're going to have an external source who just deals with their personally identifiable information, does the linkage, gets a code matched to each person's PII for each data set, and then sends that code back to us. We are the ones keeping the entire data. As researchers, we won't necessarily know people's personal identification, but we now will have a code that allows us to link the data together. So that's sort of a two-party way of having nobody's viewing the entire picture. Somebody's able to just do the matching work, and somebody's able to do the research work. And it not being the same person can mitigate some of the risks when talking to the IRB. So for this study, the ERDC was working with the full name of the offender, which was contained in every data set we were using, their date of birth, and their social security number. So with their full name, we've got their first, potentially their middle, and their last, the date of birth and the social security number. So that's about 5 fields. And in this study, we found pretty quickly that the social security number was not particularly strong. So we were able to match some records on it, but a lot of them ended up being matched without. So with this initial match, what the ERDC folks did was they took the data that we had in the DOC database, the WSUP database, and they already had the wage data uploaded to their, they have a data warehouse that they keep this stuff in. So they already had a list of people's identifiers in there and had that stable to begin with. In your case, if you're working with just databases and don't have any sort of pre-existing structure, the best thing that you can do is pick the database that you have that represents sort of your core people in your study. What does it require in your study to really be the target sample? So in our case, if we didn't have the data warehouse, we were just looking for the people who were in that Department of Corrections sample. We just wanted those property offenders. And eventually we did narrow it down to them anyway. In your case, if that's what you're looking at, that's your fullest set. So you take the data set with the people that you really need for your study and reduce it to their identifying traits. So perhaps we'll just go with their name, their date of birth, and their social security number. That's now your master set. You've got the list of everyone you need by their personally identifiable information. Then if you're just working with one other data set, it's pretty simple. You just take that one and you compare it. If you're working with more than one, you're going to need to repeat this process for each one to try to get the match lined up for each case. And for simplicity's sake, today I'm going to assume that we're just working with two databases. So you might take the PII from one database, you've created your master set, and then you take database number 2. You want to run whatever you're using. SQL is good. You can run a lot of these codes in SAS as well. Anything that you can do to run one set of these variables against the other, matching for a complete and perfect match, you will attempt to highlight and basically create a code for everything that does have a match. So in this example, I've just created a randomly generated list of names, birth dates, and social security numbers. So data set 1 is our complete set of everybody that we want. And in this case, I've highlighted in green the ones that have successfully matched. The ones that are not highlighted did not get a match. So for each of these that is highlighted, what we are wanting to tell the program to do is to create a linking ID for each of these that will tell us, okay, Research ID 1 and Research ID 1001 in dataset 2 are the same person. And then we can assign them any value that we want as long as it's unique for a linking ID. And that will remain their linking ID throughout the entire process. Now, once we've gotten this initial match, hopefully that is most of what you're dealing with, but sometimes it isn't. Once the initial matches have been made, you want to take everything that was a match and save it to its own data set. Everybody that matched, you can save and take their cross-link ID or the ID that you created to link it up and move it out. Once you've got that saved, delete them. They're out. That initial match is now done. So you've gotten a match and you don't necessarily want to take anyone who's been matched and continue matching them to other IDs. That can create a mess. So we want to reduce this list to just those that are left that did not match. The next thing that we suggest is to wrinkle the data. Now, I went weeks thinking that this was an official term, but was informed just this last week that no, in fact, it's made up. So I'm hoping that we push this far enough that it becomes official because I like it. Wrinkling the data, as we term it, is making very small changes, very, very small, to account for little imperfections that can happen when crafting a database on the part of the people who maintain it. So that can end up being, you know, a wrong letter typed into a name, or perhaps the names end up out of order. maybe the date of birth and the birth month end up switched. Or, you might have one piece of your PII that is just exceptionally weak. In our case, it was a Social Security number. We had a lot of those that were corrupt, a lot of them that were suspiciously short, and a number of them that did not even exist. If you have a complete and perfect match in everything except one piece of PII, that might require a little bit of eyeballing. A number of these might require some judgment calls if you're able to go in and spot check your database if it is of a size that that's feasible. But for the most part, just doing some of these small switches will allow you to get a number of matches. And it's really surprising how often and how many this can actually pull in for you. So for this example of wrinkling the data, I've put some boxes around the data that through just small little wrinkles, we're going to be able to fix. So in that top line, there's an example of the names being switched. This will happen, particularly with names such as my own last name, Landon, that sound like they could be a first name. This will appear all the time that you find somebody's name ends up switched in one database or the other, but the rest of their information is perfect. So just doing a wrinkle that switches these around will pop up a match. Just for those ones. Everyone else it'll ruin, but these ones, it will do it well. Those ones, once you find their match and you determine that it is indeed a good match, everything else looks like it lines up, you can give it its own unique ID, and like you did with the initial match, you remove it. With the Social Security number, in this case, it's blank. With weaker PII like this, sometimes you're able to just exclude it from the match criteria and see how many more you're able to get. If they all look like good matches, they look like close matches, then that's often an acceptable thing to do. The birthday, in this example, I've switched the date and the month, and that last one has a wrong letter in there. For those cases, if you're suspecting that you might have some bad letters, or perhaps somebody has a last name such as Rodriguez Gonzalez, there's maybe there should have been a hyphen, and for some reason their name is Rodriguez Gonzalez in one database, and in the second one it's only Rodriguez. You can do a string code to search for just the first 4 or 5 letters, or perhaps only the last 4 or 5 letters of someone's name, and find out if that gets you your matches. It's very, very rare that you're going to find a false match that is that close. Now, I did put up a couple cases here that do not have red boxes on them. One of them is clearly a completely different person. That's going to happen. You're probably going to have people in some of your data sets who just don't line up at all, and that's to be expected. They might actually be in one data set and never have entered the other for one reason or another, but then you're also going to have some of these weird ones. In one case, we've got Stephanie Riley, and in the other one, we have Stephanie Ridley. Could that be the same person? Maybe. The birthday is close, but it's not quite right. We just don't have the Social Security number on one of them to verify if that looks the same. My recommendation in these cases is to be conservative. I would much rather exclude a few cases than end up including false ones, because that can create a much bigger headache down the road. So once you have done that, you've gotten some of your close matches in. You get some more of those IDs linked. In general, I find it best to remain conservative. And once you've done enough wrinkling, you have no more close matches remaining, you want to go into that cross-link file and check to see if any research IDs appear to align. You want to make sure that the research IDs are aligning with a single set of personally identifiable information. What you really don't want to find is many research IDs aligning to single sets of personally identifiable information. That is an indication of over-merging, and you may want to backtrack and repeat some of those prior steps, maybe look for some more conservative approaches. If you're finding that a single person in one database appears to be many, many people in the other, that also could be an indication that there just simply is not enough personally identifiable information to differentiate them. In the examples that I've been using here, it's unlikely. Using Social Security number and their date of birth and their name is a lot of information for things to be too similar, but perhaps without the Social Security number, it wouldn't be too unlikely. Perhaps if we have two John Smiths who share a birthday, they would be impossible to distinguish, even though they genuinely are two separate people.
Hey, Matt, I just want to jump in. This might be beyond this conversation, but I was thinking about duplicates, and then you started talking about it, and I was like, exactly. And so I wanted to follow up real quickly and see if you had issues where, you know, especially in Department of Corrections or jail data, you have the same person that's in there multiple times, but it's not because it's an absolute duplicate, but it's because they were in there. They you know, it's maybe the unit of analysis or something is kind of muddled because you have people, but then people have multiple entrances into the system for different times they spent there. So how, this might be, you know, going down the rabbit hole, but how did you have any of those situations, and how have you handled those?
Right, yeah, great question. And this may unfortunately verge a bit on the abstract because I did not prepare, unfortunately, an example slide for this. But yeah, that's very common, that when you receive a data set like a prison set or a jail data set, you will have the same person's name entered maybe 50 times, maybe more, for every single action that happened inside of that system. Now, ours, fortunately for us, contain an ID that is assigned to that person when they enter the prison or the jail, so that every single action they take inside of that database is at least attributed to a single ID in that database. So we know that we only want that research ID or that ID within, say, a Department of Corrections database to match with one set of personally identifiable information in the wage records. So that ID that DOC has given them, we only ever want that to match once. And so when we're preparing our files for crosslink, what we'll do in advance is make sure that we reduce it to the point that each research ID and its associated identifiable information only appears one time. And so that does require a little bit of work in advance to prepare, and basically line it up so that we're going to attempt for a one-to-one match as best we can. And in fact, later on, I actually have a brief example that shows that when you have this cross-link and when it's done that way, one-to-one, you can take information such as the person's sentence. Let's say that they were sentenced for theft, and then we can associate that record with each of the 50 records that appear in the Department of Corrections database, without multiplying out those records. We just do it by associating it with the research ID. So
thank you.
That's somewhat of an answer. Sorry if it is a bit abstract.
No, I think that definitely hits on, gets to it, and I think that it was, in referencing to, the idea of sort of going down the rabbit hole or sort of opening up a can of worms. It's because I see exactly what you're saying, and I think that the process of getting there could be multiple avenues depending on what your research question is, depending on what you're looking at, and sort of key decision making along the way to narrow it down to that one-to-one link. And so I think, but you definitely answered my question, so thank you.
Great. So in creating this cross-link, once we've got those quality issues worked out, and the matches are mainly one-to-one, we might even have a few errors left in this system depending on how large your data sets are that we're just unable to fully resolve. That can be okay. You just don't want it to be taking it over. We can create a cross-link document. That's everything that you've been pulling out and saving throughout this process, and we can use that document to connect the data sets. This really shows which research IDs match between the data sets, and this is by the research ID level. So to your point, we may have a number of records in both data sets. Both data sets may have many records of the same person, but we might know that in each case, that set of personally identifiable information may be represented by that research ID linked to a specific other. So here's an example. So in our what we were going through, 10 and 15 didn't have a match, and they're in there with a missing number. We use -1. It won't confuse most programs, so SAS or SQL will still recognize this as an integer, but none of your research IDs will actually be a -1, I hope. So this won't end up matching with anybody. But these others, you can match together. And so you can see, for example, in dataset 1, we've got multiple records for these people, but only single records in dataset 2, and we can associate those single records in dataset 2 very easily with the ones in dataset 1 just by using the cross-link to match the research IDs. Again, thank you all for bearing with me. I know that this stuff can sometimes be a little dry and dense, so I did try to include some colorful offenses for these people. I think the sort of person who, is not smiling at a puppy might also be the sort of person who jaywalks, commits murder, and excessively honks their horn. So there's a sample here of what you might expect from a cross-link. Yeah.
Oh, I just wanted to, sorry, just wanted to jump in real quickly, and there were a couple questions.
Sure.
One is, did you control for shared Social Security numbers in the W-2 data? And then the second question is, are you able to control for non-W-2 incomes? For example, day labor, informal economy, etc.
Great questions. So for the question on controlling for the shared Social Security number, that is something that specifically in the wage data, I don't know that we even quite got that far because we were having so much difficulty with the Social Security number in the prison system, mostly with people reporting false Social Security numbers, that when we had we started to get some matches on them, but I don't think we got very far past 20% before we scrapped that as a matching variable. So I would need to go back and check to see how the ERDC has been handling that within their master data management system, because I do know that they have a full architecture built up, and I would guess that that's probably something that they have addressed. For the question relating to the non-W-2 wages, that is something that we cannot account for, and was something that I needed to include as a limitation in the study, is for people who are, maybe self-employed, or they're doing some other work that doesn't fall under, your average employer. Yeah, those wages we couldn't count. And so the employment count and the wage count that we did include in that earlier slide, that is probably low, and that is something we acknowledged in the paper.
Great, thank you.
Absolutely, and I'm happy to take questions throughout and more at the end. I am reaching towards the end of this piece on matching. I just wanted to talk about a couple things for troubleshooting. So match methods, the stuff that I just discussed, they're not a good way to escape from a weak research ID. So when speaking about that research ID before that might link the same person to multiple records in a single data set, if that's bad and we have a research ID associated with multiple people or one person associated with a ton of different research IDs, that mess will follow you throughout your entire match method, because the same set of personally identifiable information is going to appear like it belongs to 4 or 5 different people. So unfortunately, if there's a little bit of lacking internal validity in these data sets, this isn't a good method to go forward. The data sets really need to have some of that internal validity, and unfortunately, if they're lacking it, there's already some issues that will happen with any sort of analytics going on in that database to begin with, because ultimately you may begin double counting people or undercounting people, depending on which way your problem runs. An indication of those sorts of issues coming up in the research ID can appear in the form of those many-to-one matches in the crosslink file, and that really does mean that one person appears to match with 5, 10, 20 other people in the other database. And that can often be an indication of one person having a lot of different research IDs, so their personally identifiable information will match perfectly every time with a single set from the other. So that is something to look out for. Those many-to-one matches can be a real threat and can suggest some issues there. I did also, in talking with the RDC, want to include an example they suggested I talk about, and apparently this is more common than I realized. There are some odd quirks that will pop up and that you may discover as you're working with this, and one that they talked about was finding Mohammed with a birthday of January 1st. Apparently, this is exceptionally common in areas with high immigration, partly because when people are first coming to the country, they might not be from a culture that actually regularly tracks their day of birth. They might know their year, they might know how old they are, but they might not know their actual birthday, and so a common thing to say is January 1st. So these cases can be exceptionally problematic because Mohammed cannot be name flipped. Neither can January 1st. It's 1-1 and the same name and the same name. So if you have a weak or an absent social security number and that sort of identifier, you might really be stuck in terms of getting a clear match and also from differentiating them from each other. In these cases, although it's somewhat painful to throw away data, your best bet may be to exclude some of these records, and as a researcher, to keep notes on any particular information that goes along with those records to see if there is any slight skew that is being introduced to the database by removing some of these records. This, of course, is just one example. There are many, many others, and they particularly come up around, common name sets. John Smith is always a classic example, but there are many of just very common names that seem to pop up frequently, and they can muddle some of this work trying to match with PII. I would be someday very fascinated to do an in-depth study to find out just how that skews the data if you ever do need to exclude high numbers of similar names. So that sort of covers the process, just the overhead process of matching. And like I said, I didn't get deep into the weeds on how that might work with your code. That's something that is specific to any particular program. But that gives you an overview on what sorts of things you're looking out for and the main steps of your process might be along the way. If any of you do have questions about how you might arrange code or are interested in perhaps receiving an example or having an example posted for SQL, SAS, or something of the sort, we'd be happy to do that. But for now, we didn't want to get deep into code, particularly if there's other users of R, SPSS, or other programs who might not be as familiar with whatever particular language we chose to go with today. But as a quick overview, just as a close, on some of the benefits of the matched data, a strong match going through this method really does allow for a comparison of a much wider array of variables than might otherwise be possible, and sometimes to a more precise degree. We're able to look at the same person at multiple stages of this process rather than looking at separate stages of the process in isolation. So we might wonder, what is the relationship between the amount of time spent in community supervision and their later employment and earnings? Or how do employment and earnings themselves even relate to their later recidivism? Those questions are possible to answer once you've got data matched like this. You might still, as we always do, struggle to completely isolate causation, but you're going to be a lot closer. This also is a particular boon to criminal justice data because it allows us to track variables at each stage of the process. And in criminal justice data, something that has always bothered me is how much variables really like to change between different stages of the process. Sometimes that's a completely legitimate piece of the data. It represents something that's very, it's accurate. Somebody had a plea deal and it changed, and other times it's just recorded differently. And this allows you to account for both. So we can wonder how many individuals were arrested on suspicion of a felony assault, but they ended up in jail on a lesser charge. Or maybe which traits among those charged with sex offenses are associated with a higher likelihood of participation in prison educational programs. Very specific question, but something that might be possible with a matched data set. So our study that we briefly just touched on, that's just one example. And in my opinion, it's a very surface level example. There's a lot more that can be done with this. And just some suggestions that I'll toss out there, and I'm sure that there's plenty more to be thought of. I think the best use for this often is looking for external data, stuff that isn't necessarily in the criminal justice system, but that might still be of interest. So you might find external criminal justice records, such as doing a study where you're trying to see if any people from one particular state are offending in the state next door, and see what sorts of interstate or perhaps checking federal records and seeing if there's any sort of connection between state crime and federal crime. You also might consider medical records. EMS data is sometimes a great source for a great alternate source for looking into some violent crimes. You might also find some decedents in medical records. And education data as well can be a great addition to anything working with the prison system or education programs in prison. You might also be able to track offenders and see how their education, whether they went to college, whether they graduated from high school, whether they had disciplinary records, how any of that pertains to their later involvement in the system, or if there's any correlation, any association, or if they're able to get education at a later time. So any of those are just some ideas off the top of my head for where we might be able to take matched data sets. But really, there's an entire world out there, and with that method, hopefully all of you are able in some way to expand just a little bit into another piece of data that enriches your research. So that's most of what I have to say, and I am free and open. Love to hear any questions or comments.
Thank you, Matt. We will see if anybody types in some questions while we're waiting. We can also run the poll if Jason, if that's okay with you. I think you have the poll thing. But while we're waiting, I was wondering, is there any work that Washington's doing right now that's continuing the work that you spoke about with this report? Doing any analysis with these merged data sets?
Yeah, absolutely. I kind of danced around this because I was trying to do less full chattering about our studies, because once I get in there, I never stop. But one thing that we're doing now is a look at actually the education piece. We're kind of rerunning some of the data that we were doing on a study last year that is trying to answer, using propensity score matching, whether people, and to what degree they are benefiting from certain educational programs in prison, and looking at the difference between receiving a GED and perhaps receiving an associate's degree through prison programming. And trying to take that and look at their recidivism outcomes and their later employment and their wages. So that takes their education records, which actually exist outside of the system. We have to be able to get the records from those colleges, connect them to their Department of Corrections records and their criminal history, because that's often a pertinent thing to include in a propensity score match, and then also links that to their wage and employment. And as mentioned before, unfortunately, we really can't look at self-employment very well. So there's still that gap. And that's that study, and something that I'm interested in looking at it perhaps a later day, is while we've got that education data linked, finding out if we're able to not only look at their later employment, but find out if they continued school later on. It would be fascinating.
Great. Thank you. There is one more question, and it is the data wrinkling done manually or with a matching or entity resolution algorithm?
So that is with sort of the program, but it is a manual code. I believe our ERDC folks have a lot of code that they sort of have pre-written, having done the wrinkling so many times, so they sort of know which steps they're going to follow through, and then they put in, the new names of the databases and the variables, and rerun it there. I don't know of any software that in and of itself necessarily is pre-made to do the wrinkling, but I'm certain that with, if this is something that you're going to do regularly and you kind of have the same process time after time, you could probably create a macro and just, create it so that you can name the variables that you need, and set it through the wrinkling process so that you can kind of get your standard thing done and all those close matches out of there. I hope that answers the question.
thank you. Yes, we have one more question too. What percent of data did you get as exact matches, and what final percent match after the wrinkling?
That is a fantastic question, and unfortunately, I don't know the answer, because in this particular case, and that's something I honestly I should have asked. In this case, as I sort of referred to earlier, we had the ERDC run that entire match for us, or for me, I should say, because as the researcher, I wasn't supposed to be able to see any of the personally identifiable information of anyone in the study, so I never did. And because they're fantastic, I said, hey guys, could you please do this for me? And they returned the linked data set. And then I said, okay, can you explain how you did that? So that I can incorporate it into all of the explanation methodology of the study. And I never did ask about the immediate match and the close match. I do know that for the full match, it was somewhere in the 90s. We were, I think, about 90% matched. And this was just the people that we had in prison. So we had about 90% of the people in the prison database matched with people in the other databases.
Okay.
Yep.
Great.
So sorry I don't have a more specific answer there. That would have been a good one to know, wouldn't it?
No, I think that was our last question. And so I want to take a moment to thank everyone for attending and completing the poll, and remind everyone that we do have another upcoming webinar on the 14th, and not this 14th, I'm sorry, June 14th, and we should be opening registration for that very soon. And Matt, I want to thank you so much for today's presentation, and if people have a question for you, where can they find you?
They can find me easily at my email, which is just my name, matt.landon@ofm.wa.gov. You can also contact us through our SAC's website. We've got a little contact page on there. Those would be the best two. Again, to everybody who listens, thank you so much. And also, I do want to mention that if you are interested in reaching out or have questions, we would be happy to provide samples of code or answer more specific questions about the code process in this that I didn't necessarily want to kind of get into the weeds here.
Oh, that's great. That's awesome. And also another way to find you guys is from our website as well. If you go to our SAC map and click on Washington, you can find some of Washington's information, and that will lead you to your contact information as well. So there's a option number 3. So, all right, wonderful. Well, thank you all again for attending. Matt, thank you, and hope to see you all at the next webinar. Have a good afternoon.
You as well.
Take care.
60 people on that.